You're listening to the June 24th, 2016 edition of the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup, the weekly podcast that's focused on how the world of cybercrime is impacting business. The Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Hey everybody out there listening, I am Jeff Peters, Surfwatch Labs editor, here again with Matt Leifus, Surfwatch Labs writer. On this podcast each week, we break down the top 5 trending cybercrime events, advisories, and legal actions based on Surfwatch Labs data and analysis. So jump right into the top event from the past week.
Well, for number 1 this week, we're going to talk about this is kind of what's been going on with the hack that we talked about last week. We talked about some unknown group. There's been a little bit of information about who it might have been, but they attacked the Democratic National Committee. And so from that, now we're also finding out that the Clinton Foundation, which is headed by Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea, that has also been added to this growing list of organizations that are they're suspected of being attacked by Russian hackers. Now, there's a little bit of, what's going on with that. We have some random hacker named Guccifer 2.0, this lone wolf saying, hey, this is all me, but a lot of information is really tying that's really these Russian hackers.
Yeah, I did see a few. I think it was CrowdStrike last week. They were the ones who originally said it was Russian hackers, and I saw there's a few other security companies this week that have kind of thrown their hat into the ring saying it's probably these Russian hacking groups, Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, that are behind these attacks.
A Clinton spokesperson, they said something about the attack, and they said it appears that Russian groups are intent on attempting to influence the outcome of this election. Some of the documents stolen from the Clinton Foundation are potentially the most damaging, especially since you take into account, this is the political season. Donald Trump's going to use any ammunition, as he has shown, to attack Hillary, and this could potentially be one of those things that comes up. But as for this Guccifer 2.0, he has it's kind of an interesting situation here because he's releasing some interesting information, and it kind of makes you question, how, if he's not the person behind this attack, he has some pretty good information out there. But like I said, a lot of the people are pointing to it's these Russian hackers that are behind this attack. We'll have to see what happens with this.
Yeah, and just to add that Bloomberg News article, they reported that the hackers who hit the DNC and the Clintons' campaign, they burrowed much further into the U.S. political system than initially thought, sweeping into law firms, lobbyists, consultants, foundations, and policy groups in a campaign that targeted thousands of Gmail accounts. Everyone's talking about the DNC and the Clinton Foundation, but it sounds like it's a much more concerted, appearing to be kind of a nation-state effort. Moving on, there's another pretty huge story. Anytime $50 million is stolen, it's kind of important.
Kind of a big deal, yeah.
So there is this massive cryptocurrency theft. Thieves used 2 separate exploits in order to steal tens of millions of dollars of cryptocurrency from the DAO, which is a crowd-funded investment fund that relies on Bitcoin rival Ethereum and highly specialized computer code to automatically execute investment decisions based on all of its members. But what's worse here is, according to Ars Technica, they reported, I believe just yesterday, that copycat attacks are continuing to happen. They wrote that on Friday, thieves exploited a software bug that allowed them to transfer more than 3.6 million Ether, which is the base unit of this digital currency, out of the DAO's coffers. This digital loop made up more than a third of the 11.5 million Ether that this DAO had. And the seized booty is valued anywhere from 45 million to 77 million, depending on the exchange rate, because obviously after this attack, the exchange rate's plummeted quite a bit. So they're talking about how they can possibly get this money back, and there's sort of this... It's kind of interesting because cryptocurrency, the whole idea is there's no regulation. So they have a solution where they can kind of roll back, or however you want to describe it, so that these Bitcoins that were stolen, they can kind of invalidate them. But then, of course, that's kind of sparking a lot of discussion of whether they should do that, because basically some people are arguing it's kind of like you're bailing them out for their insecurity.
Absolutely. Bitcoin's interesting to me because I get it. But man, I got to tell you, it just seems like there are a lot of problems associated with it at times.
Yeah, there's just, you see so many thefts and so many cases of people losing. A little insurance is nice in a bank account.
Yeah, that's right.
Thought.
That's right. Coming in number 3, we're going to talk about Acer. Acer suffered a data breach through its e-commerce site. Acer is currently in the process of notifying their users that their information may have been compromised. The breach lasted from May 12, 2015, all the way to April 28, 2016, so any customer who accessed Acer's e-commerce store during this time period is at risk. The data they're talking about being exposed are names, addresses, and payment card information. When this story initially came out, they didn't really talk about how many potential victims there were, but according to a representative from Acer, they said that about just over 34,000 customers were affected by this breach. And these customers were vastly, the majority of them were throughout the U.S., Canada, and Puerto Rico. Besides that, is there anything else that's known about this, Jeff, what's going on?
I was looking at a few different articles this morning, and I didn't really see a lot of details on the specifics of what happened, but I did see that the PC World article, some spokesperson told PC World that the data was stolen because the company inadvertently stored the stolen customer data in an unsecured format. Moving on to the number 4 trending event, we've had a lot of talk about Anonymous and targeting these different banking institutions. And this week there was reports that other banks around the world were targeted by DDoS attacks. Banks in Indonesia and South Korea, the central banks there, were potentially hit by Anonymous, although there's really no clear evidence that the hacktivist group is behind the attack. Both banks told Reuters that they had experienced DDoS attacks, which is in line with this Op Icarus campaign that we've talked about before on the podcast. And it turns out that several central banks were hit by similar attacks, and the banks said that the attacks were pretty much unsuccessful because they were sharing the IP addresses and there was a lot of coordination among the central banks. So it sounds, at least from what the bank said, like they did a pretty good job of sharing intel and staying on top of that.
Probably why Anonymous didn't go on like a big social media rant about, hey, we did this, because they probably thwarted the attack, so there's nothing to brag about.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw, Matt, there was an article from Clickhole. You ever read Clickhole?
A little bit, yeah.
It's basically like a satirical BuzzFeed.
Yeah.
But there was an article about Anonymous. I thought it was pretty funny about how Anonymous leaked all the Kohl's employee names from 2003. And there was just this article, just kind of the whole gist of like the stuff they release really doesn't matter.
Right, it's like, who cares?
Yeah,
man?
so
Good
they're
for
like,
you.
well, if you lied about being a Kohl's employee in 2003, you better cover your tracks.
Yeah, I did read that when you posted that earlier today. That was kind of funny. And number 5, our last trending target for the week, we're going to talk about GoToMyPC. They suffered a data breach, and customers at GoToMyPC were actually forced to reset their passwords as the company experienced this breach, and this is, what they're trying to do to get ahead of it. The company released a security advisory explaining the breach. According to GoToMyPC, the company suffered a, quote, very sophisticated password attack. Customers were given directions for how to reset their password, as well as a list of recommendations for creating a strong password, which I thought was a great idea, because I think that's a very small thing you could do for customers. Like, don't tell them to just reset their password. No, give them some ideas. However, GoToMyPC was criticized with their password recommendation to customers because they didn't mention that you should use a password that you're not using for it. You need to use a unique password you're not using anywhere else, as password reuse, as we're finding out massively, is a huge problem for organizations. So they didn't say anything about that. They were criticized a little bit about it.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the top advisory from this week. There's a lot of articles about password reuse, and kind of getting back to, you said GoToMyPC said it was a, quote, very sophisticated password attack. Now that's interesting because there was an article on CSO by Steve Reagan, and he was basically saying all these companies are saying there's this sophisticated password attacks and they're seeing all these breaches, but all they're doing is reusing the stolen LinkedIn passwords and stuff. So he was saying, how sophisticated is it? But just to kind of back up on what's going on here is there's a variety of organizations across many different industry verticals that are confirming incidents of data exfiltration stemming from password reuse. A few different sources confirmed with CSO's salted hash that there were upwards of 30 instances of sensitive information being stolen. However, they wrote that it's possible these incidents are only the tip of the iceberg and there could be potentially many, many more. Now, what's interesting here is you mentioned go to my PC. This article by Steve Reagan, he said that the common thread in all these data breaches is the LinkedIn list. There was that huge password breach previously. Generic password policies, we just kind of talked about that. A lack of two-factor authentication and remote access software from services such as GoToMyPC, LogMeIn, and TeamViewer. So it sounds like they're taking this password list, reusing it on these different companies that have this remote access software, then they're using that to get into different company data.
What's frustrating about that is with this password reuse problem, if you think about it, this is one of the easiest things that we could combat right now. And that's the problem, is that no one cares, because if their information's stolen, they're just made whole again down the road. I mean, they don't care. So it's like how many times have you ever gotten like a credit card, it says like, oh, your account was compromised, here's a new card. Any charges were made, okay, just taken care of. Why would we care?
Yeah, I think it's that, obviously the people listening to this podcast, it's like we're preaching to the choir. Obviously, they know about the importance of passwords. But I think if you still, even with all the stuff in the news, if you ask the average person, they don't really probably understand quite why everybody talks about you need good passwords, you can't reuse passwords. Ever since you were a kid, you've had that beaten into your head and usually ignored.
Right.
But once you start seeing all these stories, for example, in here they talked about how, an attacker who has this LinkedIn list, not only do they know the person's name, but they know their work history, they know their password. Thus, they have a list of possible targets. They have a good idea of how different network IDs are generated, some of these base passwords that you use. There's just all sorts of stuff they can kind of go to try to compromise different organizations.
Right.
It's like you constantly hear the drumbeat, passwords, passwords, passwords. And there's a good reason for it.
Well, we got to keep marching on, though. Moving on with advisories, we got a whole mess of malware we're going to talk about. We're going to start off with a point-of-sale malware called Punky POS. Panda Labs discovered a new point-of-sale malware in May, and a source also told Brian Krebs about a possible infection with this Punky POS on the computers of CC Pizza, which is a recent restaurant chain that was breached. So this is what Panda Labs had to say about this. The cyber criminals behind the attack haven't been very careful. Since the server was not configured correctly, Panda Labs was able to access it without credentials. Researchers were able to view all the computers infected with Punky and map out their distribution around the globe. They discovered over 200 infections, most of them in the U.S. Punky is designed to target only Windows machines running point-of-sale software. The malware comes with two components: the keylogger that looks for number sequences like credit card numbers, and a memory scraper that collects anything that looks like track 1 or track 2 information. So we don't hear nearly as much about point-of-sale or breaches, but we've actually heard quite a bit this year about a new point-of-sale malware coming out. This seems to be another one.
Yeah, and it's not a huge number of infections, but still 200, that's a pretty reasonable amount.
Mm-hmm.
There was some other malware that made news as well. Ransomware, a few different advisories related to that. Two different ones in particular stood out this week. There is this Dead Decryptor ransomware. And this one made a lot of headlines because it was a fun ransomware, if you want to say it that way.
Well, yeah, they used a creepy picture of Santa Claus with like a stogie out of his mouth. It was just a creepy little gotcha type of ransomware.
Security researcher Lawrence Abrams, he provided a little bit of info on this ransomware. And he said that it's been around for quite a while and it targets both English and Russian-speaking victims. When installed, the victim's desktop will be changed to show this evil-looking Santa having a good time while it encrypts your files. And then Dead Decryptor will change the wallpaper of the Windows desktop to an image that contains the ransom amount and an email address. And of course, then you got to pay to decrypt your files, all that jazz.
Yeah, nothing probably that really stands out compared to a lot of other ransomwares, except for what they try to do with that image.
Yeah,
and whatever else.
Seems like the ones that, a lot of times, like there was the Breaking Bad one a while ago that everyone's talking about just because they try to come up with these unique angles. Which it seems like you almost shouldn't, because if you want to stay under the radar, you don't want to get all these headlines about you.
Right.
But then another ransomware that people were talking about is this RAA ransomware. This one's being discussed because of its unusual code, which is written in JavaScript instead of other more popular programming languages. This isn't a new method for ransomware, but it's not seen on a regular basis, so we've got a few articles, people talking about it. RAA is distributed through email attachments. Because JavaScript does not have any cryptography functions, RAA uses the Crypto.js library, which enables AES encryption when locking user files. So those were kind of the two ransomware developments everyone was talking about.
Ransomware is becoming a pretty big threat, but here's another threat that it's definitely getting attention. It's not quite getting the attention of ransomware, but that's business email compromise scams, or widely known or referred to as BEC scams. So a couple months ago, the FBI issued an alert about these BEC scams, and they had some estimates. They're saying that, what was the time frame? I think it was from 2013 to the present day when they released it 2 months ago. So you're talking April 2016. They estimated that companies that over 17,000 victims had lost over $2.3 billion from BEC scams. Well, now fast forward to May, late May, early June, they released another alert about it, and those figures have increased. They're now estimating that more than $3 billion has been lost through BEC scams, with an estimated 22,000 victims. And this goes to point, this is a phishing technique used by hackers. Its main objective is to get money out of you. One of the things that they pointed out, the FBI in this alert, which you can read on IC3 if you so choose, very easy to find, they talked about a new method being used in these BEC scams. They do a really good job. They had 4 main ways that the emails could play out, whether it was someone you work with, a high-ranking official, things like that. Now they've added a 5th, which is data theft, which makes a lot of sense, right? We've talked about the 2015 tech season. A lot of companies were targeted, and the majority of those attacks were actually BEC scams. They'd act like they were, a high-ranking official. Hey, they talk to, send an email to human resources saying, hey, I need all of our employees' W-2 information, and they get it. So it's another way that these BEC scams are being implemented, again, for the sole purpose of making money. It seems to be the purpose of all of these, but a pretty interesting read. The FBI really goes into depth about, how to prevent it, and, some ideas and suggestions of what you can do. But that's just another thing. We're talking about ransomware. We should probably point out that these BEC scams are also becoming very prevalent in today's cybersecurity landscape.
And then the last advisory we're going to talk about this week is just a couple of new pieces of banking malware. The first one is this Get Banking Trojan. And this one's interesting because it's a Trojan as a service. Security researchers at Trend Micro have discovered this new malware, which has ties to the Brazilian hacking underground. And on this underground, they're offering it as a banking Trojan as a service. You can either rent it for $600 every 10 days, or you can buy the source code for $8,800. Researchers say that this malware has only targeted 9 Brazilian banks so far, and it's able to obtain user credentials for PayPal accounts and other social media services.
Yeah, in our next, we talked about this probably a couple months ago. It's a hybrid malware called Gosnim. Gosnim is a banking malware, and again, it made news initially about a couple months ago when it was first discovered. The malware has been spotted targeting financial institutions in the United States and Canada, and it now has a new tool. The malware has always been able to use web injections as an attack vector. Now the malware can use redirection attacks as it sends users to a fake banking portal. So we've seen that before. It redirects a user to a fake banking portal. They upload their information. Well, now the hacker has that information, and other things can happen from that. So another banking malware kind of making news.
Those were the top cybercrime events and advisories. Now moving on to some of the legal stuff. We've talked about Wendy's quite a bit on this podcast because they're one of the really big, one of the big stories of the year, really, especially in terms of point of sale breaches. And there's been another class action lawsuit that's been filed against them. And this has to do, obviously, with their data breach. I think we talked about on the podcast last week or the week before about how previously Wendy's had announced that the breach is actually much bigger than they had thought. Initially, they said it was, about 300 stores, but now they believe it's many more, although they haven't said the exact number. But this class action lawsuit has been filed on behalf of all financial institutions that issued payment cards affected by the fast food chain's point-of-sale breach. So this lawsuit alleges that Wendy's systematically failed to comply with industry standards and protect payment card and customer data. It also goes on to say that Wendy's systems were not updated to the new EMV terminals, that the payment card information wasn't properly deleted, and that other standard security tools were not properly maintained. So it's kind of similar to some of the other lawsuits that we've seen, but it's just seems like every week there's another big item in the news for Wendy's.
Yeah, that'll be the new thing we talk about each week, Wendy's. Another legal advisory, we haven't talked about the Home Depot in, I don't know, maybe a New York Minute, I'm not sure. But they're back in the news, and they're filing an antitrust lawsuit against Visa and MasterCard. Not long ago, we talked about Walmart filing a suit against Visa over the right to only accept PIN transactions for debit card purchases, rather than letting consumers choose between PIN or signature. So right after that happened, the Home Depot has also filed a related suit. Home Depot has filed an antitrust lawsuit against Visa and MasterCard, claiming that they colluded to prevent the adoption of the more secure chip and PIN technology. Signature-based transactions come with higher fees for merchants than PIN-based transactions. And this is, according to the lawsuit, quote, Visa and MasterCard have pushed consumers to use payment card technology that Visa and MasterCard know is effective and subject to fraud, and have colluded with each other and with the banks that issue debit and credit cards to do so. And the lawsuit also went on to say, while chip and PIN authentication is proven to be more secure, it is less profitable for Visa, MasterCard, and other member banks as it provides a greater threat to their market dominance. And that makes a lot of sense because when we talk about EMV, there was a shift in liability. So if you have a store that doesn't have these EMV terminals and there's a data breach, the store is liable. But now if these EMV terminals are put in and there's a data breach, then the payment, like Visa and MasterCard, they would be reliable. So, I mean, I could see why there would be the motivation to do that, perhaps.
Yeah, and with the previous Walmart suit, I believe because Walmart was one of the first big retailers to put in EMV, and they initially said you had to use PIN if you're going to use the chip. You got to use chip and PIN because they argued it's more secure. Plus, I'm sure it saves them money too because they get to pay less on the PIN transactions. So you could look at it the other way. Walmart wants to force people to do that so they can save money. But yeah, it's kind of a similar case here where they're saying you're pushing the less secure and more profitable one than the less profitable, more secure version. Moving on to the number 3 story, the Securities and Exchange Commission, they put out a press release alleging that a UK resident has hacked into online brokerage accounts of U.S. investors, and then he made numerous stock trades on these investors' accounts in order to profit on his own account. So this complaint alleges that this individual hacked into the numerous accounts of U.S. customers of broker-dealers, both in and outside of the U.S., and that this scheme netted him $68,000 in profits for himself and led to victims losing at least $289,000. But what's interesting here is that in the complaint, they actually haven't found this guy. And in the complaint, they said that there's a substantial risk that he may be continuing his scheme through other brokerage accounts that the commission has not yet identified. So it's possible he could, still be doing this to more people ongoing as we speak. They did issue an emergency court order. They froze more than $100,000 of his assets, and they prohibited him from destroying evidence while the SEC pursues further penalties. But from what I read, they don't actually know where he is. So I don't know if he's on the run or he just hasn't come forward yet or what.
Right. Yeah, prohibiting him from destroying evidence. So we'll see how that plays out. Coming in number 4, we're going to talk about the mobile advertising network InMobi, and they paid a settlement to the Federal Trade Commission. So again, this mobile advertising network, they will pay $950,000 in civil penalties and implement a comprehensive privacy program in order to settle charges it deceptively tracked the locations of consumers to serve them geo-targeted advertising. And this, the Federal Trade Commission announced this on Wednesday. And here's what Jessica Rich, who's the director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, said. InMobi tracked the locations of hundreds of millions of consumers, including children, without their consent, in many cases totally ignoring consumers' express privacy preferences. She went on to say, this settlement ensures that InMobi will honor consumers' privacy choices in the future and will be held accountable for keeping their privacy promises.
Yeah, and from what I remember, I believe it was actually a larger settlement, like $4 million, but it was lowered due to the company's inability to pay, I believe. And then finally, just a couple of quick updates on some legal news that we've talked about. We talked a few times about this US-EU privacy shield and what's going on with data transfers between, European citizens and the US. Well, the European Commission is apparently ready to present an updated draft of the privacy shield, which hammers out a lot of the different contentious privacy issues from the previous draft. And this is according to the EU Justice Commissioner. The primary concerns revolved around, U.S. government access, bulk collection, independent oversight, things like that. But apparently they've come to an agreement on all those, and it sounds like that's going to be going forward. Potentially they're going to reveal that in early July. And then another thing that's been in the news quite a bit is we've been talking about this expansion of the FBI surveillance powers, giving them more hacking authority or whatever you want to call it. And there was a vote in the Senate, and that vote did not pass. They needed 60 votes. They only got 58. So this Senate proposal to allow the FBI to use national security letters to obtain information such as like an individual's browsing history without a warrant in probes related to terrorism or federal intelligence, that's been rejected. So whatever side of the aisle you're on that, good or bad.
Yeah, so congratulations or sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, and that wraps up the week's events, advisories, and legal actions. Now moving on, we have our funny story of the week.
Yeah, this story might not be funny for diehard Game of Thrones fans out there.
Woohoo!
Myself included. There's a website that is targeting Game of Thrones fans, so essentially the majority of the world. I don't know anyone that doesn't like Game of Thrones. Of course, maybe I just hang out with a bunch of nerds or something. I don't know. The website allows customers to spoil the show for people they do not like for just 99 cents. An endless stream of spoilers can be sent towards a victim of your choosing. The website is called Spoiled.io. It is rumored that this website was created after the tale of a woman who sought revenge against her ex-boyfriend by texting him Game of Thrones spoilers every night. And I would make the argument that the intentions of this website are pretty evil. And I gotta tell you guys, alright, don't spoil these shows for people. Last week's episode of Game of Thrones, and I'm gonna do everyone a favor, I'm not gonna spoil it. But I had a friend that spoiled it for me. Just by a little message before I got to see it. And just from that little message, I completely understood what happened. And I was not happy. Do not spoil Game of Thrones for people. It's not fair and it's not funny.
Or just try to watch it live right when it airs so that you don't have to worry about that.
Well, that's true. Well, I was watching the NBA Finals. I'm kind of I saw LeBron get his championship for Cleveland, so.
Yeah, that's justifiable. That wraps up this week's podcast. The Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs helps organizations and service providers quickly establish a strategic cyber threat intelligence operation that drives more effective use of their tactical defenses. For interviews with cyber experts, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, The Cyber Chat. And for more information on cyber threat intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.